rejected by his mom. This rescue bobcat grew up with a house cat like siblings. Winter had come to the Green Mountains of Vermont the way it always did. Not as an arrival, but as a slow, deliberate claim. Snow descended in sheets over the ridges and valleys, muffling the forest until the world seemed wrapped in wool. The white pines stood like sentinels, their branches heavy with ice, and the wind moved through them with a sound like breathing. Franklin Reed stood at the edge of the clearing behind his cabin, a wool coat pulled tight around his shoulders, his breath rising in pale clouds. In his left hand he held a simple wooden box. Inside were the last of Helen's ashes. He had scattered most of them years ago, but he had kept this final portion. Unable to let go completely. Now, on the 5th anniversary of her death, he had finally come to finish what he had started. Beside him sat Ollie, the cream-colored cat Helen had raised from a kitten. Her eyes were still bright, still watchful. The tree stood before them, a massive sugar maple where Franklin and Helen had sat together when they were young, where they had carved their initials into the bark. He opened the box and let the ashes fall. They scattered on the wind, some catching in the snow, some drifting away into the forest. For a moment he stood perfectly still, listening to the silence. Then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I'm ready to let go." Hell. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in 5 years, Franklin felt something inside him shift, not relief, exactly, not peace, but something like permission. That was when he heard it. A cry thin and desperate came from somewhere deep in the forest. It was not the sound of a bird or a fox. It was something smaller, something fragile. Franklin lifted his head, and Ollie's ears went flat against her skull. They both stood frozen, listening. The cry came again, fainter this time. Franklin's hands were already reaching for his phone. He dialed the number for Maplewood Wildlife Haven, the rehabilitation center where he had volunteered for years. The woman who answered, a young biologist named Sarah, listened as he described the sound. "We've been tracking reports of poachers in that area," she said. "There was a site we dismantled 2 days ago. If there's a cub out there, it won't survive the night." 3 hours later, Sarah called him back. They had found a bobcat cub, newborn, barely breathing, hidden beneath a tangle of brush near the poaching site. There was no sign of the mother. "Franklin," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made him close his eyes. "Can you take it?" He looked down at Ollie, who was sitting at his feet, watching him. Then he looked out the window at the forest, where the snow was still falling. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. When Franklin arrived at Maplewood, the cub was so small it fit in the palm of his hand. It was wrapped in a wool blanket, its eyes still closed, its breathing shallow and uneven. "Born today," Sarah said quietly. Franklin felt something tighten in his chest. He had cared for a female bobcat once, more than 10 years ago, a young wildcat that had been injured in a trap. Her eyes had been fierce, burning with a kind of defiant life. He had nursed her back to health and released her into the forest. And he had never forgotten those eyes. This cub had the same eyes. He brought the cub home and made a nest for it in the corner of the living room, lining a cardboard box with one of Helen's old sweaters. The sweater was soft and worn, pale blue with tiny white flowers stitched all over. Franklin had kept it folded in a drawer, unable to give it away. Now he spread it carefully in the box, smoothing out the wrinkles. The cub wouldn't drink. Franklin tried everything he knew, mixing milk with a touch of honey the way Helen had taught him. But the cub turned its head away, too weak even to cry. Franklin stayed awake through the night, checking on it every hour. Sometime before dawn, exhausted, he fell asleep on the floor beside the box when he woke. The first light of morning was coming through the window. He sat up, his back aching, and looked into the box. Ollie was there. She had curled herself around the cub, her body a warm crescent, her eyes half open and watchful. The cub was nestled against her belly, breathing more steadily now. Ollie looked up at Franklin, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite name, something ancient and patient. "Looks like we're parents now," Franklin whispered. He named the cub Spud. Over the next few days, Spud began to drink. First just a few drops, then more. His breathing grew stronger. He began to make small sounds, mewling cries that Ollie answered with soft chirps. Franklin found himself sleeping better than he had in years. He started playing his ukulele again, the instrument that had sat untouched since Helen died. The cabin, which had been a tomb of memories, began to feel like a home again. The snow began to ease, the sky cleared, and pale winter sunlight filtered through the trees. It was as if the forest itself had been holding its breath, and now it was exhaling. Spud grew quickly. Within weeks he was walking, batting at Ollie's tail. Ollie tolerated him with the patience of a saint. She groomed him constantly, licking his fur until it stood up in ridiculous tufts. The bond between them showed itself in small ways. Ollie would always eat first, but she would leave exactly 3 pieces of kibble in her bowl. Spud would wait, watching, until she walked away. Then he would dart forward and take them, every single time, when Spud had nightmares. Ollie would get up from wherever she was resting and lie down beside him, one paw stretched across his back. The nightmares would stop. Franklin noticed that whenever he played the ukulele, Spud would climb onto the coffee table and sit perfectly still, head tilted. Ollie would sit at Franklin's feet. Once, Franklin stopped mid-song to adjust a string. Spud made a small chirping sound. Franklin looked at him. Spud chirped again. Franklin smiled and kept playing. They developed a routine. Every evening before bed, Franklin would sit on the floor with his back against the couch. Ollie would climb onto his left shoulder, draping herself around his neck like a scarf. Spud would curl up in his lap. Franklin would rest one hand on Spud's back, feeling the rumble of his purr, and scratch behind Ollie's ears with the other. In the mornings, Franklin would wake to find them positioned on either side of him in bed, Ollie at his head, Spud curled against his ribs. He would lie still, feeling the weight of them, the warmth. His hands would rest on fur, one on each animal, and he would think about how Helen used to wake him the same way. The geometry was different, but the feeling was the same. Being anchored, being needed. At night, Franklin started reading out loud, old novels, poetry, the newspaper. He would sit in his chair with a book, and Spud would be on the coffee table, Ollie on the arm of the chair. Sometimes Spud would put his paw on the page. Franklin would stop and look at him, and Spud would look back, unblinking, then remove his paw. Franklin would continue. There were small discoveries Franklin made about being a father. Even at 73, he learned that Spud preferred to be carried facing outward, so he could see where they were going. He learned that Ollie needed to inspect Spud every morning, nose to tail, before she would allow herself to eat. He learned that if he hummed while cooking, both animals would appear in the kitchen and sit side by side, waiting. These were not the actions of a caretaker. These were the actions of a parent, attuned to the rhythms and needs of his children in ways he had never been given the chance to be before. Helen had wanted children. They had tried for years, then stopped trying, then grown quiet about it. Franklin had poured himself into his veterinary practice, into other people's animals, into anything that let him use his hands and heart without thinking too much about what was missing. Now here he was, decades later, a father after all. The realization hit him one afternoon as he watched Spud and Ollie playing, batting a pine cone back and forth across the floor. He had to sit down, his hands were shaking. He thought about all those years of feeling like something was incomplete. And here it was, this strange little family, filling spaces he hadn't known were empty. One morning, Franklin found Spud trying to bury his food bowl, using his paws to scrape at the wooden floor, frustrated when nothing moved. Franklin knelt beside him and watched. This was instinct, something deeper than learning, something wild asserting itself. He got a shallow box, filled it with dirt from outside, and placed it in the corner. Spud immediately began using it to bury things. Toys, food. One of Franklin's gloves. Franklin would unearth them later, carefully, and put them back. This became another ritual. Spud burying, Franklin excavating. A conversation without words about what could be kept and what had to be released. One particularly cold afternoon, Franklin found Spud shivering by the window, too stubborn to leave his post watching the birds outside. On impulse, Franklin retrieved the blue sweater and gently worked Spud's front legs through the sleeves. The cub squirmed at first, then went still as the soft fabric settled around him. The sweater was far too large, the sleeves hanging past his paws, the hem pooling around his haunches. Spud looked down at himself, then up at Franklin with an expression of confused tolerance. Then he turned back to the window and resumed his vigil. Now a small bobcat in an oversized blue sweater with tiny white flowers. Ole came to investigate, sniffed the sweater, then curled up beside him. They sat together like that for the rest of the afternoon, and Franklin took no pictures, made no fuss. He just watched, knowing he would remember this moment for the rest of his life. The forest responded to their family. On days when Franklin felt lighter, the chickadees would gather outside the window, singing their two-note calls. When he was sad, when the weight of missing Helen pressed too hard, fog would roll through the trees, thick and gray, muffling everything. He began to notice the pattern. The forest was not indifferent. It was attentive. It breathed with them, mourned with them, celebrated with them. One afternoon, Spud discovered his reflection in the mirror. He crouched low, his ears flattened, his tail twitching. Then he launched himself at the mirror with a ferocious yowl, slamming into the glass with a thud. Franklin laughed out loud, a sound that startled even him. It was the first time he had laughed like that, deeply and without restraint, since Helen had died. Ollie looked at him, ears forward, as if checking to make sure the sound was safe. Franklin kept laughing. The cabin felt warmer somehow, the shadows less heavy. Franklin started keeping a notebook in the kitchen, jotting down observations. Spud's eyes changing from blue to gold. Ollie teaching him to wash his face, the way they sleep now, always touching. Simple things that felt monumental. He realized he was documenting not just their growth, but his own. The way being responsible for these two creatures was pulling him back into the world, making him pay attention again, making him want to be present for each small moment, because he understood now how quickly they passed, how precious they were. But as Spud grew, something else began to grow too, a wildness. Spud started climbing, not just the furniture but the walls, his claws finding purchase in the wood paneling. He knocked over lamps, shredded curtains, hunted shadows. At night, when the wind picked up, he would stand at the window and growl, a low rumbling sound that made the hair on Franklin's neck stand up. The conflict gnawed at Franklin. Part of him wanted to keep Spud safe, to protect him. But another part, the part that had been a veterinarian for 40 years, knew that keeping Spud was wrong. It was selfish. One morning, Franklin found Spud standing at the back door, his front paws pressed against the glass. Beyond the door, a deer was crossing the clearing. Spud's pupils were enormous, his tail lashing. Franklin opened the door. Spud bolted out, racing across the snow. He didn't get far before he stopped. Suddenly uncertain, looking back at the cabin, Ollie appeared beside Franklin, pressing against his leg. Spud took 2 steps toward the tree line, then stopped again. He sat down in the snow and cried. A sound caught between wild and tame. Franklin went to him and picked him up. Spud buried his face in Franklin's neck. The pattern repeated itself. Spud would push against the boundaries of the cabin, then retreat. He would climb to the highest shelf, growl at his reflection, attack the curtains, then seek out Franklin or Ollie for comfort. Franklin recognized the conflict. Spud was being pulled in 2 directions, and neither pull was wrong. He began taking Spud on longer walks into the forest. At first, Spud would stay close, darting behind trees but always circling back. Ollie came too, moving slowly but determined. Franklin would stand still and let Spud explore, watching as the cub climbed trees, stalked birds, pounced on shadows. Once, Spud caught a mouse. He brought it to Franklin, dropped it at his feet, and sat down, waiting. Franklin knelt and examined the mouse. It was dead, a clean kill. He looked at Spud, and Spud looked back, eyes bright. Pride radiated from the cub's posture, the lift of his head, the set of his ears. Franklin felt an answering pride swell in his chest. This was his boy, his wild, capable boy. He nodded slowly. The grief was for what he knew was coming. The pride was for what Spud was becoming. Back at the cabin, Franklin would find Spud staring out windows for hours, his body coiled tight. At night, the cub would pace, wearing paths on the floor. Franklin started leaving windows cracked open so Spud could smell the forest, hear it. The sounds that came in brought the cub alive in ways that Franklin's touch no longer could. He would watch Spud's ears swivel, watch his nose work, watch his whole body orient towards something Franklin couldn't hear or see. One evening, Franklin was washing dishes when he heard a thump from the living room. He found Spud on top of the bookshelf, 8 feet off the ground, his eyes fixed on something outside. Franklin followed his gaze. There, at the edge of the tree line, was a fox. Spud's whole body had gone still, every muscle tensed. This was not play. This was something else, something primal. Franklin watched the fox disappear into the underbrush, then looked back at Spud. The cub was trembling, not with fear but with suppressed energy, with need, with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Franklin began writing in his journal again, something he hadn't done since Helen died. He wrote late at night, after Spud and Ollie had fallen asleep. "I don't know if I can let him go," he wrote one night. "I know I should. I know it's the right thing, but he's brought something back to life in me, something I thought was dead. How do I say goodbye to that?" He wrote about Helen, about how she had always known when to hold on and when to let go. She would nurse a bird back to health and release it the same afternoon. No ceremony, no hesitation. Franklin had always struggled with that. He wanted to protect, to keep safe, to prevent loss. "You would know what to do," he wrote. "You always did. You would tell me that keeping him safe in here means killing what makes him alive. You would remind me that love means wanting what's best for them, not what's easiest for us. I know all this. I know it in my head, but my heart, hell, my heart wants to hold on." Every time he wrote, Spud would jump onto the desk and curl up beside his hand, purring softly. Spring came slowly, the snow melted in patches, revealing brown earth. The forest began to wake. Birds returned, streams started to flow again. Franklin took Spud outside for longer periods now. Spud moved with more confidence, his movements becoming sleeker, more purposeful. His coat had thickened, his paws had grown large. He was no longer a kitten. That was the day he saw Pamela. He had driven into town to pick up supplies, and on the way back he passed a rescue operation on the side of the road. In one of the steel cages was a female bobcat. She was snarling, her lips pulled back, her eyes blazing with fury. Franklin pulled over without thinking. He walked up onto the cage, and the bobcat went still. She stared at him, and he stared back. And in that moment, he knew. It was her. The bobcat he had cared for 10 years ago. Pamela. Her eyes were the same, fierce and defiant, but now there was something else in them too. Recognition. She remembered him. Franklin spoke to the rescue team, and they told him what had happened. Pamela had been caught in a poacher's trap near the site where Spud had been found. They believed she had been trying to protect a cub, but by the time they found her, the cub was gone. Franklin's throat went dry. "How old was the cub?" "Newborn," the team leader said. "Born the day we found her." Franklin felt the world tilt. Spud. Pamela was Spud's mother. Pamela was rehabilitated and released back into the forest. Franklin went to the release, standing at a distance, watching as the cage door opened and she bolted out, disappearing into the trees. But before she left, she turned back and looked at him. Just for a moment, and in that look, he saw gratitude. The days after Pamela's release were difficult. Spud's wildness grew more pronounced. He began rejecting his food, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. At night, he would sit at the window and cry, a sound that tore at Franklin's heart. Ollie tried to comfort him, grooming him, curling around him. But Spud pulled away. He was restless, agitated. He was ready to leave. Sarah from Maplewood called one afternoon. "Franklin, we think it's time. Pamela's been seen in the area. If we release Spud near her territory, there's a good chance she'll take him back." Franklin didn't answer. He hung up the phone and sat down heavily in his chair. Ollie jumped into his lap, pressing her head against his chest. That night, he couldn't sleep. He got up and went to the window, looking out at the forest. The moon was full, casting silver light over the trees, and there, at the edge of the clearing, he saw her, Pamela. She was standing just beyond the fence, her eyes fixed on the cabin. She didn't move, didn't make a sound. She was just watching, waiting. Franklin stood there for a long time, looking at her, and she looked back. In that silent exchange, he understood everything. She knew her son was here. She knew Franklin had saved him, raised him, kept him alive. And her eyes held no plea, no demand. They only conveyed a profound appreciation to the one who had sheltered them both. And they also expressed the longing for her child. Franklin felt something inside him finally give way, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. He understood. Pamela knew he was here. She knew Spud was here, and she was waiting. Not demanding, not threatening, just waiting. With the infinite patience of a mother who knows her child will come home when he's ready. Franklin pressed his hand against the cold glass. Pamela's ears twitched forward. For a moment, they were just two parents, understanding each other across the distance. Then Pamela turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Franklin alone with his decision. He went to the drawer and pulled out Helen's sweater. He held it to his face, breathing in what remained of her scent. Then he folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He went to the cage where Spud was sleeping and opened the door. Spud woke immediately, his ears perking up. He looked at Franklin, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Franklin stepped back, and Spud walked out. He padded across the floor to the door, and Franklin opened it. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp. Spud hesitated at the threshold, looking back at Franklin. His eyes were shining, wide and uncertain. Franklin knelt down and pulled the sweater from his pocket. He held it out to Spud, and the cub sniffed it, rubbing his face against the soft fabric. Then Franklin tied the sweater loosely around Spud's neck. His hands shook as he tied the knot. "Go on," Franklin whispered. "She's waiting for you." Spud looked at him one more time. Then he turned and walked out into the night. Franklin watched him go, watched as he crossed the clearing and disappeared into the trees. Pamela stepped out of the shadows, and for a moment, she and Spud stood face to face. Then Pamela leaned forward and touched her nose to Spud's, and they vanished together into the forest. The pale blue of the sweater was the last thing Franklin saw, a small patch of color disappearing into the darkness. Franklin closed the door and sat down on the floor. Ole came to him, pressing against his side, and they sat together in the dark. The next week was the hardest. Ole lay in Spud's old sleeping box, refusing to eat, her eyes dull. Franklin tried to coax her out, but she wouldn't move. He understood. She was mourning. So was he. He began writing letters to Spud, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen and paper. "Dear Spud," he wrote, "I hope you're doing well out there. I hope your mother is teaching you to hunt. To Saram, I hope you're happy. Ole misses you, so do I, but I know you're where you belong." He never sent the letters. He kept them in a wooden box by the stove, adding to them every few days. One morning, a few weeks after Spud had left, Franklin opened the door to find something on the porch. It was a toy mouse, one of Ollie's old toys, dirty and chewed, but unmistakable. Franklin picked it up, turning it over in his hands. He knew what it meant. Spud had brought it back. Over the next few weeks, more toys appeared, a ball of yarn, a stuffed bird, a tattered ribbon. Each one was something Spud had played with when he lived in the cabin. Each one was placed carefully at the door. Franklin collected them, laying them out on the kitchen table. Ollie sniffed each one, and something in her seemed to revive. She began eating again, grooming herself, moving with more energy. Then one morning, Franklin found the sweater. It was folded neatly on the porch, just outside the door. The pale blue fabric was dirty, worn thin in places, smelling of forest and wild things. But it was unmistakably Helen's sweater. Franklin picked it up with trembling hands and held it to his face. It smelled of lavender and pine and bobcat, of past and present, of loss and love and letting go. He brought it inside and washed it gently, then folded it and placed it back in the drawer. But now it meant something different. It wasn't just Helen's anymore. It was Spud's too. And Franklin's. It was all of them together. One evening, Sarah from Maplewood came to visit. As they sat at the table drinking tea, she glanced at the wooden box by the stove. "What's in there?" she asked. Franklin hesitated, then opened the box. He handed her one of the letters. Sarah read it slowly, her expression softening. "Franklin," she said quietly, "these are beautiful." "They're just letters," he said. "No," she said. "They're more than that. Can I take them, but I'd like to share them at the center. I think people need to see this." Franklin didn't know what to say. Finally, he nodded, a few days later. Sarah called. "We posted the letters outside Spud's old enclosure. People have been reading them." "Franklin, they've been crying. You've shown them what it means to love something enough to let it go." That winter, the snow returned. Franklin stood on the porch one morning, his breath rising in the cold air, and saw a figure sitting at the edge of the clearing. Spud. He was grown now, strong and healthy, his coat thick and glossy, more beautiful than Franklin could have imagined. He didn't approach the cabin. He just sat there, watching. His eyes were golden now, fully changed from the blue they had been as a kitten. Adult eyes, wild eyes. But in them, Franklin could still see the small creature who had fit in the palm of his hand, who had learned to trust, who had learned to love. Awes. Franklin smiled. He went inside and came back with a hammer and nails and some old boards. He spent the afternoon building a small shelter at the edge of the clearing, a simple lean-to where Spud could rest if he wanted to. It wasn't a cage. It wasn't confinement. It was just a place to be close. His hands remembered the work. He angled the roof to shed snow, reinforced the back wall against the wind, and left the front open. As he worked, Spud watched from his spot at the tree line. Ollie came out and sat on the porch steps, supervising. When he finished, Spud walked over to the shelter and circled it twice, sniffing. Then he lay down inside it, his head resting on his paws, his eyes on the cabin. Franklin sat on the porch steps, Ollie at his feet, and they watched the snow fall together. The silence was comfortable, complete. Ollie made a small chirping sound. Spud answered from the shelter. A low rumble. They were talking. Franklin realized they had their own language. Franklin thought about Helen, about the day he had scattered her ashes, about the moment he had said he was ready to let go. He thought about Spud, about the wildness in him, about the way love had made him stronger, not weaker. He thought about Pamela, standing at the edge of the forest, waiting for her son to come home. And he understood something he hadn't understood before. To love something doesn't mean to keep it. It means to be present, to show up, to stay close even when there's distance between you. It means to let the ones you love live the lives they were meant to live, and to trust that the bond between you is strong enough to survive the separation. Every year after that, on the anniversary of Helen's death, Spud returned. He would climb onto the roof of the shelter and lie there, watching the cabin. Franklin would sit on the porch with Ollie, and they would watch the snowfall together. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because they all understood. The forest understood too. When Franklin was sad, the snow fell heavier, the wind grew cold and sharp. When hope returned, the mist would clear, and pale sunlight would filter through the trees. The Green Mountains had become more than just a place. They had become a presence, a witness to everything that happened within them. It was the fourth member of their strange family, silent but always listening. Sometimes Franklin would wake at dawn and find Spud sitting outside the window, close enough to touch if there were no glass between them. They would look at each other for long minutes, neither moving. Then Spud would stand, shake the snow from his coat, and disappear into the trees. These visits were irregular, unpredictable. Sometimes weeks would pass with no sign of him. Other times he would appear 3 days in a row. Franklin learned not to anticipate, not to expect. He learned to receive each visit as a gift. Ollie's reaction to Spud's visits changed over time. At first she would run to the door, crying, wanting to go out. Then she began simply sitting at the window, watching. Eventually she seemed to understand. Spud was both theirs and not theirs. He belonged to himself, to the forest, to his mother. What they had together now was different from what they had before. Not less, just different. Franklin continued to volunteer at Maplewood, and Ollie went with him every time. She became the unofficial foster mother of the center, grooming orphan kittens, lying beside injured martens, offering her warmth to any creature that needed it. The staff called her Saint Ollie, and Franklin would smile every time he heard it, watching Ollie with the orphaned animals. Franklin saw Helen's legacy continuing, the same gentle persistence, the same bottomless capacity for care. Ollie had learned it from Helen, just as Spud had learned from Ollie. Love propagates itself through generations, through species, through time. One afternoon, as Franklin was leaving the center, Sarah pulled him aside. "I have something to show you," she said. She led him to the far side of the property, where a new plaque had been installed near the entrance. It read, "In memory of Helen Reed, and in honor of Franklin Reed and Ollie, who taught us that love is not possession, but presence." Franklin stood there for a long time, reading the words over and over. He thought about Helen, about the sweater she had worn, about the way she had taught him to mix milk with honey, about the love she had given so freely. He thought about Spud, out there in the forest, wild and free and alive. He thought about Ollie, curled up in the truck, waiting for him. And he thought about himself, a man who had been so afraid of losing love that he had nearly forgotten how to live. But now he knew. Love doesn't end when someone leaves. It doesn't disappear when you let go. It just changes shape. It becomes something that can survive distance and time and even death. That night, Franklin sat at the kitchen table and wrote one more letter. "Dear Spud, I saw you today, standing at the edge of the clearing. You looked strong and healthy, and I was so proud. I hope you know that letting you go was the hardest thing I've ever done, and also the most important. Your mother, Pamela, gave you life. Ollie gave you warmth and comfort, and I gave you what I could, but the forest gave you freedom, and that's the greatest gift of all. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if you'll ever come back. But I want you to know that you'll always have a place here, not in a cage, not in confinement, but in my heart. And that's a place that nothing can take away. With love, Franklin." He folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box. Then he went to the window and looked out at the forest. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting silver light over the trees. And there, just barely visible in the shadows, he saw two figures moving together through the snow. Pamela and Spud, mother and son. Franklin smiled. Ollie jumped onto the windowsill beside him, and they watched together as the bobcats disappeared into the trees. The forest seemed to sigh, the wind moving through the branches with a sound like contentment. The snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the world in white. And Franklin felt something he had not felt in 5 years. Peace. Not the peace of forgetting or the peace of moving on, but the peace of acceptance, of understanding that love is not something you hold on to with clenched fists. It's something you release with open hands, trusting that it will find its way back to you when the time is right. He closed the curtains and turned back to the cabin. The fire was burning low in the stove, casting warm light across the room. He went to the drawer and pulled out the sweater one last time. He held it for a long moment, feeling the softness of it, the weight of everything it carried. Helen's lavender soap, still faintly there. The forest scent Spud had left behind. His own tears, absorbed into the fabric that night he had held it after letting Spud go. The sweater had been with him through everything. It had cradled Spud in his first hours of life. It had been the bridge between the cub's wild nature and the warmth of home. It had traveled into the forest and returned, marked by both worlds. Now it held all of them together, the living and the dead, the past and the present, in a few yards of pale blue fabric. Franklin folded it carefully and placed it back in the drawer, not to hide it, not to forget it, but to let it rest, to honor what it had been, what it had done, without asking it to be anything more. Ollie rubbed against his legs, purring. "Come on," Franklin said softly. "Let's go to bed." They walked together down the hallway, the old man and the old cat, their footsteps quiet on the worn wooden floor. The cabin settled into silence, the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. Outside, the forest stood watch, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The Green Mountains held them all, the living and the dead, the wild and the tame, in an embrace that would never let go. And somewhere out there, in the heart of the wilderness, a young bobcat lay curled against his mother, a faint memory of lavender still lingering in his dreams, dreaming of the place he used to call home. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.